was coming here from my hotel. One of the guys gave me a ride, and he's like, "What are you talking about tonight?" And I said, "The battle between Wall Street and Main Street." And he said, "Well, I thought that was won already." And I said, "Yeah, but there's certainly a lot more fighting to be done, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight." Of course, a number of things have happened today even, and this is one of the aspects of covering or continuing to look at the beneath the surface of what Wall Street does, what the relationships are between Washington and Wall Street, how they're sort of manipulated, how expensive they've become. I don't know if you've watched or seen or read about so far. I'm sure a lot of you have Ben Bernanke's confirmation hearing this morning. Yeah, I know. Where I was home in LA, and I was watching the beginning of it this morning to do a piece on it. I had a piece up the night before, the 10 reasons why you should hit the road, and then I was watching the confirmation hearing, and just not hearing, except from a couple little places, the real difficult questions that really should be asked at this point, not just of the Fed, but of really anyone who has been in a position of bringing money into and trillions of dollars into a banking system that is so unreformed, so unrepentant, so dangerous, and so very expensive for all of us, not now just because we have been really subsidizing its bailout and its practices, but also because even before we've been really on the hook, we've been on the hook anyway. And there's a lot of those issues. And last year, when the bailout started, when Wall Street collapsed, when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, when AIG was given all these money to back the bad credit bets that they had made with the rest of the street, who had made them on the other side and were therefore involved in the same bad credit bets, I started wondering exactly where, A, all this money was coming from, and B, where it was going, because there was only some aspects coming out of Washington. There was a $700 billion TARP program, which was the only official component out of what became a $13 trillion bailout and subsidization of the industry. And it's an enormous number. I can't even explain what a trillion looks like. We don't think in terms of trillions, but that is what actually occurred. And yet what is public is, it was $700 billion. Congress voted on it. It was part of an Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. It was necessary. If it didn't happen, then all of the world would fall apart. Life as we know it would cease, and nobody would we'd have chaos in the streets everywhere. And that was part of the fear and the impetus for really, really extorting tremendous amounts of money from us into Wall Street, more than had ever been done before. Forget the off-balance sheet stuff. Forget the tax implications. Forget the bonuses leading up until last fall. Since last fall, it got even worse. This year, by not doing anything about it, it got even worse. So when I started to write this book, it was the beginning of this year. It was January. It was after I thought I had enough information to look at exactly what the Treasury had done to help the banking industry, to look at what the Federal Reserve had done to help, to look at what the FDIC had to be called in to do beyond what their actually responsibilities are to us as depositors, and just backing and insuring deposits, and how much was open in how many different ways. And it's interesting because a lot of the information is somewhat public. But you really have to dig for it. There was no report, say, on the Treasury Department website that said, all right, well, this is how much we're paying and this is how much it's worth every single day, which if you're running a Treasury Department or a company or your checkbook, is something that I think should be acknowledged, particularly in a public situation. There was none of that. The Federal Reserve has a balance sheet that is completely convoluted. It used to be 4 pages, now it's 13, but that doesn't even really represent the manner in which it's become complex, because most of what the Federal Reserve has done to support the banking industry is completely secret. We still don't know what sort of affair was going on, what loans were given to support the banking industry as it was sinking last year, what was given in return. We know there were no strings attached, but basically what the trade was, what actually went on. And the Federal Reserve, of course, refuses to disclose any of that information, despite a number of Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, despite losing, for example, to Bloomberg and to the late Mark Pittman, lawsuits against the Fed to basically disclose what exactly it has done. And we still don't have a lot of that information. So the pillage that I talk about in the book really tries to piece exactly how every bit of this bailout and subsidization came together and where it's gone to and how much we're on the hook going forward. But one of the things we do know today is that after the crisis that we all spent a lot of money for and still will be for decades to come that happened last year for banks, there were two things going on. One was the Main Street economy is actually worse today than it was then. Before last fall, before that chaotic period, for example, unemployment was at 5.8% going into that fall. It is now at 10.2%. Foreclosures are at a new record, a new quarterly record now after the bailout relative to what they were before the bailout. Defaults, delinquencies, any sort of way of measuring any sort of credit situation that deals with individuals and their own pockets is worse now than it was $13 trillion to the banking industry ago. On the other hand, we have the fact that the banks, surprise, are making record profits. Not all of them, but the bigger ones that have become bigger as a result of all the maneuvers that happened last fall. We have, for example, Goldman Sachs, my old employer, who is at record profits, record bonuses, up 15% relative to what they were in 2007 before the 2008 crisis, completely unapologetic, completely unrepentant, doesn't even understand as a firm or as any individuals that run the firm exactly what the problem is and why anyone would think that they're not entitled, this is capitalism, this is free, we earned it, we had problems, we now sort of magically came out of them, and that's okay. It's God's work. And when I was working at Goldman, I'll tell you, it was obviously I left. It was an environment, and it's not just at Goldman, but it's throughout Wall Street. It just happens to be on steroids at Goldman, where the thing that you care about, that you're pushed to every single day, is worrying about how much you're going to get paid. It is about nothing else. There's no conversation, there's no meeting that takes place in any conference room, in any office that says, hey, you know what, how are we going to make our clients happy? Obviously they don't want to lose their clients, but that is not the first question. The first question is not what we do for them, it's what we do for us. And the first thing that is on everybody's mind and is constantly on anybody's mind is how much am I going to get paid? If I do this trade, how much am I going to get paid? If I work in one department and I coordinate a trade with another department, how much are they going to get versus how much am I going to get? And this is literally something that happens every day. That's the mentality. I was in a situation, this was like very soon before I quit, where I was involved in credit derivatives, actually. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but basically in sort of a lesser form or a smaller form than what they became. But on the credit side, looking at credit risk, looking at some of the systemic issues that are now a problem that are currently not being looked at in terms of finding real solutions. But there was another group that was working on interest rates and foreign exchange rates and other things. And there was sort of a battle because there were lots of transactions that had a credit piece and traded across different nations, so had a foreign exchange piece. And when you create a transaction that includes both pieces, it could be anyone's bonus. So I had a group working on the credit side. This guy, Harvey, had a group on the other side. I talk about Harvey in all my books. Actually, I didn't inject, but there's a whole page that explains what a Harvey is. It's kind of a noun as well, but it's the idea of sort of taking credit for anything you don't do in order to make money. And it's a big component of a lot of how rises happen in Wall Street and certainly other places as well. But so I'm upstairs. Well, I'm on the 29th floor, which is 26th floor, where Lloyd Blankfein's office was at the time. He's now the CEO of Goldman Sachs, the one talking about God's work. He used to be running one of the divisions that incorporated credit and foreign exchange and also commodities, all the oil trading and everything else. So I'm sitting with the head of the sales department, who sort of incorporates me and Harvey. And he's like, right now, just so you know, Harvey's walking up the stairs to take credit for that big trade. It was with an insurance company. And not to mention the exact name, but it's emblazoned by a duck. Okay. But anyway, There's this whole complicated trade. It's worth like, I don't know, at the time, $9 or $12 million in fees or whatever it is. And, pocket change now. But the head of sales says, Harvey is running up right now to tell Lloyd that, it's his group, it's his trade. And I'm like, well, he had nothing to do with it. He's like, I'm telling you, he's up the stairs. So picture, there's an office here, there are stairs here, and Lloyd's here. And there's a lot of desks and sort of, trading screens and everything in between. So I'm here, Lloyd's here, Harvey's here. And I'm told, all right, what you need to do, you need to get to Lloyd's office before Harvey goes and takes credit for this trade. And first of all, I don't even know how he knows this. But I'm like, all right, fine, I guess. And I kind of hesitate because this whole thing is just, it's years of this. And I'm just like, this is so ridiculous. I can't believe I'm going to actually do this. And he's like, don't think, just go. I'm telling you, he's going up the stairs. So I'm like, fine. He literally takes me out of his office, walks me to the door, and starts sort of moving me towards Lloyd's office. Meanwhile, I get to Lloyd's office, and Harvey's already there, like sitting down. Like I don't even know how quickly. And he's a big guy too, so I don't even know how this actually maneuvered so quickly. And I kind of hover at the door, and they're sitting there like they've been chatting for an hour. And I knew, like, you've lost this entire situation, at which point, and it wasn't obviously just because of that, but I was like, this is really, really way too ridiculous. And of course, there are many instances like that. But just to show you, there's literally a strategic physical maneuver to take credit for anything in front of whoever can actually pay you for it, which at the time was Lloyd in our division. And that's the kind of thing that goes on. It still goes on every single day. So when we look at the fact that a Goldman is on track to make $23 billion this year in bonuses, and they happen to still owe the federal government $45 billion, which they conveniently forget because they are allowed to say they paid back $10 billion besides that of TARP money. That is basically half of what they still owe the government. So we're actually completely paying for all of those maneuvers that are going on. The biggest place that's hiring right now in Wall Street are the departments that are putting together the toxic assets that blew us all up last year. They're called distressed asset-backed securities. And yes, they were very, very distressed. We called them toxic, and now they are one of the main places for hiring and for presumably making more profit the next time around. So not only has nothing been learned, but actually there's more of a subsidization for what happened than before. And that is definitely a problem. It's also a problem that a company like Goldman and Morgan Stanley, which used to be investment banks, which trade, which make most of their money not out of dealing with regular people, but in dealing with mostly their own transactions, but somewhat client transactions and on big, big scale, are called bank holding companies. They're called companies that basically are allowed to get federal backing. They don't just have it, they didn't just get it, but they actually will maintain it and be allowed to get it and have it in our current structure into the future. And of course, they're not the only banks that have made, lost, and now are making a lot of money again on the back of taking a lot of risk. There's certainly the big banks, the too big to fail banks, that have become bigger, more complex, more risky, and more apt to not just fail, but fail more strongly and in a much harder crash this second time around than they did the first time because of the fact that they're bigger and more complex. So we had a situation last fall where, for example, Bank of America was going through tremendous problems, and so was Citigroup, and so was JP Morgan, although they say they weren't. And so was Wells Fargo, although they say they weren't. And as a result of everything that was going on, what happened was the entire field of banks consolidated. So now you have Bank of America, which I'm sure some of you bank with, who's merged with Merrill Lynch, which is a trading shop, which is a hedge fund, which no one still to this day knows exactly what positions it holds. Most of all, Bank of America doesn't. And I'll explain why that's in a second. But this was a merger. This is one of the biggest mergers, not necessarily in terms of value, but in terms of risk, that has occurred in the banking system, and it was completely pushed for, subsidized, and hastened by the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, and the New York Federal Reserve when it was headed by Tim Geithner, who now, of course, is the Treasury Secretary, trying to act as if things like that hadn't happened last year, everything would be so much worse than it is now. So this idea that possible worse is worse than very bad now, that continues to be the way it works there. And that was kind of evident as well in the confirmation potential confirmation or reconfirmation of Ben Bernanke, who was a part of that as well. Now, I actually believe of the three, Tim Geithner, Ben Bernanke, and Henry Paulson, the Treasury Secretary at the time, of course, also a former CEO of Goldman Sachs, he had, I think, more of a role to play in reconstructing the landscape of banking, in other words, to help Goldman, to sort of help Merrill, rather than go bankrupt, because it was, after all, run by John Thain, who had been the number 2 guy under Hank Paulson, actually, when I was there, and then went on to run the New York Stock Exchange, went to run Merrill for 10 seconds and a lot of money, and then came on to basically be involved in that merger into Bank of America, which has been, I think, a disaster. Now, Bank of America, that said, is posting profits. They're doing quite well. They've had these tremendous rebounds in their trading-oriented divisions, mostly because no one's checking the value of a lot of what they have. You know, all of a sudden you go from a very negative to a high positive in a year. A lot of that is based on government capital. It's also based on trading government capital. It's also based on marking whatever they have on their books however they want, because there doesn't really seem to be a lot of eyes on it. And this is where you know, I get very angry, you know, and I've written about it. Even, obviously, the book came out in September. I finished it in the end of July, and things keep on getting more ridiculous. And that's part of the problem. Going back to Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, I just did a piece on Monday comparing the situation that's now developing in the banking industry to being far, far worse than Enron. Now, Enron is sort of the poster child of fraud. Now, it's so small compared to what's going on. It's just little. But the idea of hiding stuff on your books and making it seem like everything looks really good, and then it not being really good, is part of this. And what I did, following the book, and just over the last few weeks, a month or so, is go through the books of Bank of America and Wells Fargo and Citigroup, the sort of most interesting in terms of where do they get their profits from. I'll put Goldman Sachs aside for a second. I know kind of where they got their profits from. But I just went through like a couple thousand pages of SEC filings, and it's very geeky and convoluted and et cetera, but I wasn't looking to analyze every single page. I wanted to answer one simple question, which I would think, after all of this, if you're regulating, if you're funding, if you're anywhere in Washington in a position where you can actually give money to this industry and not ask any questions and not give it any strings, want to know, is simply how much of your money is coming from trading and how much of your money is coming from client business. You know, you would think this should be somewhere around the beginning of their filings. It's a really basic question. How much is coming from taking risk to not taking risk? Being that the risk that was taken almost brought down the system, collapsed a bunch of large banks, almost collapsed and should have collapsed a bunch of other large banks, and created more banks that are more complex than they were before, isn't that something that should be a little bit more transparent? And the problem is, and not getting into too much detail, but is that none of the books are similar, for one thing. All these institutions are different. But they kept changing all of the way that they categorize all of their trading. So there is absolutely no way to compare apples to apples from this year to last year. So all we get are the headlines. You know, profits are up, everything's good, et cetera. But actually extracting the risk from the non-risk is very difficult. And with respect to Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, I was talking to one of the spokespeople of Bank of America because I said, you know, you don't break down Merrill Lynch even in your balance sheet. And he's like, well, why should we? Actually, what he said was, well, you can't unscramble the egg. And I said, well, wouldn't someone running the company just want to know that? Shouldn't we be reporting that to the SEC, any of that? And he said, well, you know, there is a separate report that just deals with Merrill. Like, well, he just said they're merged. Yeah, well, there's a separate report. And there is a separate report, but the separate report has, like, no relationship to the full Bank of America. So it's really impossible to actually get any information out of that. But no one seemed to think that was a problem. I talked to a spokesperson from Wells Fargo, which was a big bank that bought Wachovia, which was a mess of a bank, and has now become a larger mess of two banks. And I asked the same question. I'm like, you know, it seems to me you've changed a lot of stuff around, and I can't really see where you're breaking down trading revenues and where they come from. And the response from the person at Wells, who happened to have a Wachovia email address, which I found interesting, because you're so merged, but you couldn't do the internet difference and the email difference. And she said, well, Wells didn't do it, so, you know, why should we do it? So, because you're a bank that's twice as big. And anyway, so it wasn't so much interesting to debate with them. The point was that this is really simple stuff. It actually doesn't require, a PhD in math. I have a tremendously great research assistant who actually is a translator. That was her job, and I started getting her into looking at some of this stuff because it's much more an issue of language really than an issue of numbers. The numbers is really basically addition and multiplication and subtraction. It's really simple, but the language is what keeps changing and being moved around. So my fear is that not only have we dumped a lot of money for no reason into the system, but it's really going to be very difficult to figure out how it's being used and whether actually what it is portrayed to be in terms of profits and revenues actually is accurate, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of questions about this. So again, today when I saw the hearing this morning and not a single senator asked Bernanke and there were some good questions, but the simple question as to do you think there's still risk in the system? I mean, obviously thinks there's systemic risk, but it's like, have you looked at these books, Ben? Have you noticed that there are numbers that look really, really good right now? Like really good? Does that not bother you? Do you really not think that that's something you should be at least admitting you're going to look into? And I think not only did he not admit it and no one asked, but I don't think they know. And so a lot of this is really trying to piece together almost like a CSI type financial situation where we've spent a lot of money and a lot of it isn't known. And part of that is also because the way the banking system is structured is so merged right now, and it becomes more and merged, and it was made more merged last year, of course. But even going into that time period, we had 10 years of mergers that occurred after the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which was an act that had been administered in 1933 during the height of the Great Depression, that had basically done something to address this very notion of having a financial institution that could take risk, that you couldn't really monitor, or you didn't really understand, or maybe they were lying, and mix it up with things that the bank was doing with regular people, with regular depositors, giving out regular normal loans. And the whole idea of Glass-Steagall was that banks should not be allowed to do both because the government can't possibly back both, and nor should it back both. And not only shouldn't it back both, but doing both in one institution tends to wreck the economy. And so the logic, and it was a bipartisan situation. FDR, the president at the time, was a Democrat. The Treasury Secretary was a Republican. There wasn't this sort of like, what side of the issue is it? It's like, look, the banks really screwed up the finances of the country, and they did. There were foreclosures then. There were defaults then. There were house problems then. Today, that number is 10 to 1 compared to back then in terms of the number of foreclosures versus then. Of course, more people own houses now than then. But there's definitely a magnitude issue where we're not necessarily in a better situation today than we were going into that act and going into that period. So it is really still quite dangerous. And at the time as well as now, it was real estate assets mixed with things called trusts that were off balance sheet, that were off the books, that you couldn't monitor, that you could borrow against, that you could speculate against, that you could try and sell to investors and make them think it's better and worth more than it is until it isn't, until nobody wants it, until it all collapsed, which is exactly what happened going into last fall, and exactly the situation that we have actually more now, because now we're actually funding it. So really, the notion of banks being able to look at loans and at deposits and at money that's really coming in from individuals, which is real. That's not borrowed fictitious, we're going to create it. You know how many deposits you have. You know how many loans you've given out. It's very easy to figure out. And it's less risky, therefore. It doesn't mean people don't default. It doesn't mean those loans aren't in some cases awful and predatory and should be looked at amongst themselves. But it does mean that you can actually get some information about it from looking at them. When you start piling on all sorts of structures and the whole Harvey Me thing and all these different transactions that really intersperse different kinds of risk into one security, that's when you can't figure out what's going on. So banks shouldn't be allowed to do that. And that was the nature of what Glass-Steagall said. There is some motion today, sort of in Congress, by a couple senators only, though, to really separate the banks out to the same extent. There are more and more voices that are coming out that think this is a logical thing to do. It's logical to separate the risk from the non-risk, particularly when you have to front it. If it's any individual's money on the line, if someone's in Vegas and they point to you and say, hey, I just lost $100, can you loan me $100? And you say, well, I don't know, kind of you just lost it, but okay, fine. But then they go to like 10 other people, don't tell them about you, and keep borrowing 100, 100, and 100, and all of a sudden they're putting 1,000 down, they lose, they have to pay back 1,000, they have none of it. So you continue to basically exacerbate a problem that already exists, which is that you lost the first 100. And that is exactly what the banking system has been doing and had done going into last fall's crisis. And it's a lot easier not to do that to the extent that it can hurt everyone else if you're not making the kind of money that you're making from taking the risk, from doing that borrowing, and dealing with that first 100. This is a lot easier to contain. And the way, in terms of the numbers that it works out, and there's been a lot of blame in general in the crisis for it just being about subprime loans. And it wasn't, well, it was barely about subprime loans. The way subprime loans got intermixed was very simple. If you think of kind of an upside-down pyramid, but the point, it's upside down. So the point's down here. Say that in the point, there's some subprime loans. And in this country, $1.4 trillion worth of subprime loans were created from 2002 to 2007. So during the period when Greenspan had reduced rates by a lot, from 6.5 to 1 3/4, between 2001 and sort of the end of 2002, there was a lot of cheap money. Banks decided, hey, we have all this money. We can't make money off of a regular mortgage, people, because we're not going to get enough spread. We're not going to get enough if we lend out at a certain level and we only charge something a little bit more in terms of interest rates. We want to charge a lot more. So let's go figure out a way to do that. And that's why subprime really started to grow. So the amount of subprime loans issued tripled in the time between 2002 and 2007 as it had been 5 years prior. So there was certainly more being made, and that we know. The total was $1.4 trillion. But what increased by even more were the assets that were created from those loans. And that's really where the problems start to happen. So you have these loans, and $14 trillion worth of assets were created from stuffing them with little bits of this $1.4 trillion of loans. So all of a sudden you have another layer in this period of $14 trillion of stuff, of asset backs, of things called CDOs, of things with all sorts of different letters, names to them, and it doesn't really even matter what they are. Think of a box where you stuff the bottom layer of the box with something real, and then you stick styrofoam sort of in it for the rest of the box, and then you wrap it up in a nice bow. And in financial terms, that bow is the rating agencies who said, all right, well, this box looks good. We'll just give it our stamp of approval. We'll call it a AAA box. And off you go, and you try to sell the box to an investor. And the investor could be in Iceland, which is like a mess of a situation right now. It can be in Stockton. It can be a pension fund. It can be a hedge fund who might or might not know what they're doing. It might look in the box or might not. But the point is, pieces of this box were then parceled out some more. And everybody had a piece of the box. The banks borrowed against the box. So they said, all right, well, here's $14 trillion worth of boxes we're going to sell. But before we do that, we're going to do the Vegas thing, and we're going to borrow 10 times the amount of money we say this box is worth. So all of a sudden, the banking industry was basically under $140 trillion worth of stuff. So that's kind of your pyramid. You go from 1.4 to 140. So no wonder when any little problem happened here, the whole thing toppled down. And you get that, right? I mean, this is something, though, that it's really that simple. I mean, how you evaluate the boxes is kind of a secondary point. That's literally the process. And this is something that is still not being questioned right now. It's like, okay, well, these banks who still have pieces of these boxes, the ones that they couldn't sell, still on their balance sheet, they still have money they need to pay back because they borrowed against it. But you know what? It so happens that the amount of the subsidy to the banking system was about $13 trillion. At one point, it was $19 trillion. Certain programs have been closed, and I keep a record on a monthly basis on my website of the monthly bailout figures. So they do change. I do want to be honest with my figures, and so when they close things, I do close them. But at the point now, it's around $13 trillion. It had gone up, it had come down. But that happens to be about the number of assets that were created. It is a coincidence. It's just one of these things that I find interesting. But it's a lot of money that now, again, is subsidizing this whole creation. Now, there's been no change since the bailout in dealing with this upside-down pyramid. There's certainly been about no help to subprime or other types of borrowers. In fact, there are more defaults. As I mentioned before, there's higher defaults now and higher foreclosures now and higher delinquencies now than there were before all this money was given to help with the top part of the pyramid for the rest of Wall Street, who made $300 billion just on creating the boxes, like doing nothing but creating them and getting them out the door during the 2002 to 2007 period. And now we have a situation where we are now backing the boxes. And the questions aren't coming in as to, A, how do we stop that? And B, how are we letting banks use loans, whether they own the loan company or whether they fund the loan company, to create these boxes that they then sell, take on the risk, and then crash, and then we come in as the public and save them. So it goes back to this notion of what do we do about it? What do we do about it is we break up the banks. We go back to and forward into, at the same time, a Glass-Steagall situation where we can divide the risk from the non-risk, where it's okay for the government to back the non-risk. It is not okay to back the risk. It's not okay to have not let AIG fail. It's not okay to help AIG not fail by, in the process, giving $13 billion to Goldman Sachs. They're big boys. They could have dealt with their losses or failed or whatever. They just happened to have gotten a whole lot of help from the federal government, and in also different ways, as did the rest of the banking system. It's not really okay for when Bear Stearns failed in March of 2008, before the main debacle of the bailout started to happen, to pay for its risk in a merger into JP Morgan Chase, who got the benefit of any possible upside that buying that decayed company would give them, and has no downside risk because we own that risk. So, that's not the right role by any stretch of imagination of the government. It would have been cheaper and more efficient and more intelligent to, when there was a situation at the bottom of this pyramid, to help the subprime assets, to help the individual loans, not to assume that if you give the money to the banks, it's going to somehow trickle down. Like, when does that happen? We're not getting the bonuses. Credit hasn't loosened like it was promised to do. It has tightened. It is harder to get credit. It's impossible to renegotiate mortgages. It's really, really difficult. It's time-consuming. Pieces of deeds are lost. Anyone who's tried to do it, it's very distressing, and that's if you're given the time. And what the government could have done much more cheaply is go directly and deal directly with homeowners, and directly, in the same manner, even in a cheaper and lower manner, actually, but in a more helpful manner than they did with the banking system, which was just sort of dump the money into the top of this pyramid and somehow, assume it will work itself out, and then pat themselves on the back this year because the system's doing so well. And so, we're still not doing well. The problems still exist. The banks are now more complex and more risky and less understandable and less regulatable. And these conversations that are going on in Washington tend to kind of center on how do we regulate them, and how do we make sure that they put their own capital, which is our capital, behind their risk going forward. It's going to be a long time before they pay back everything that they've received, whether it's in the form not just of TARP, that they're paying back, but all the other trillions of dollars that have gone into the system, some of which will never come out, and some of which may come out in drips and drabs later, but there's no way to really evaluate that, and there's no demand or call for it. So that's kind of one of the basic things that we're still dealing with. There are people in Washington who do get this. There's Senator Sanders in Vermont who's come up with a too big to fail, too big to exist bill, which, again, really simple. It goes back to the days of Glass-Steagall. We shouldn't be subsidizing risk. As a government, as a public, period. If you take it, you own it. And that wasn't what happened on Wall Street. It's basically they had it. They took the wrong risk. They hurt a lot of individual people in the process because in order to create the boxes, you had to keep on extracting and changing and doing all sorts of things with the loans at the bottom of the pyramid. And then they sort of walked off this year, and they will walk off this year with record pay. And so that's just wrong. So the idea of making banks smaller will also make risk smaller, which should make compensation smaller. And it should also take us out of the equation. It should take the government out of the equation because you shouldn't back risk you don't understand and can't control. And so that's really what I think we need to do in Washington. And in terms of what you can do in this, it's really to make your voices heard. When I ended this talk in San Francisco, I had someone email me afterwards and you talked about all these things and we had questions and everything was fine, but before that you ended with, I'll write your congressperson, and I got really upset with you. And I do understand this because I go off on Congress people all the time. But I think there are some ideas that some of them come up with that deserve credit, and there are some non-ideas that deserve to be yelled at. And so when I think about how do you communicate with that, I think that's something to worry about. That's something where we actually can be effective. I know there are some senators who truly don't understand banking, but truly are trying to do something about it. And I mean, for example, Senator Cantwell is trying to do something about derivatives. Now, there's so many complications in derivatives, so I think doing something about them requires understanding what you're up against. And I think there's a whole education thing that needs to happen in Washington, because I think it's just not what they do. Even the ones on finance committees, it's not necessarily where most people in Washington don't come from a finance background. So, you're dealing with fighting this animal that has this whole other set of an arsenal than you do. And I think that tries to make it seem complicated, because the more complicated you make it seem, the harder it is to do something about or to fight against. But it's really not that complicated. It's like, you have to reduce your risk, and we will not pay for it. And the details are separate from that. So it is something where you can kind of see what your favorite Congress people are doing, and actually just at least support what they're doing, because it does mean something. It's kind of it's sort of like high school in Congress, and it is very much about it's about popularity. There's a whole lot of stuff going on. Obviously, part of that is campaign contributions, and there's things that are very difficult to deal with. But there's also hey, wait a minute, people are talking about my act, and I'm getting support, whether it's my constituents or whether it's filtering into the media or whatever else, and that tends to matter because no one wants to lose their job. And I think a lot of them will lose their jobs for how they're handling the aftermath of this financial crisis, and I think they should. And this is on both sides of the aisle. This is not partisan. This is just some of them are just not getting it, and some are trying to do something about it. And I think it is a very big issue because our country happens to run or be connected to running in the wake of what a lot of these institutions have done and continue to do in terms of the risks that they take and the money that we put up now behind it. So we do have to do something about that. And of course, there are a lot of other actions. There's certainly a lot of, there's Americans for Financial Reform. There's group actions. There's individual actions like that as well. So it really depends on what you're comfortable with and what you feel most motivated to do. I tend to write a lot about this stuff, but it's really about just making voices heard. I think at least it's a huge fight. It's like the guy in the car who drove me said. I think they won. And yeah, the mechanism of Wall Street it's very powerful. It's very integrated. It's very revolving door. But in the end of the day, they only have so many votes. So there is something to us having the ability to say, look, this is crap, and we're not going to take it anymore, and we're angry, and you've pissed away our money, and we don't want you to continue to do that. So that's kind of a decision that we have to push and that we have to make. Anyway, I want to open it up to questions, and thank you.
Thanks. A very interesting talk. Sheila Blair, it seems to me, said something very similar to you about kind of dealing with the bottom of the pyramid almost a year ago. She's been effectively silenced. Can you give us any insight into what happened there?
No, that's a really good question. She's been silenced, I think, to a large extent. I think the FDIC is the only body with sort of real money on the table. They had a real insurance bucket that when banks fail, they are there to back depositors. That was part of what came out of Glass-Steagall, the whole idea of breaking up the banks and creating an FDIC at the time to deal with supporting the deposits and individuals, the citizens' risk within those banks was created back then. And she and the FDIC are responsible for dealing with that. And I think she's made the point many times that if you have too much risk in the bigger system, that becomes impossible. To some extent, is what I'm saying. It's in a different way. She's holding only so much money. And, of course, she's gone back to Congress a couple times to get more in order to protect the deposits because that's her job. And that's something she has taken true responsibility for, unlike, say, the Fed, who doesn't seem to take any responsibility for what's happened in terms of the wake of this crisis, what's happened to individual banks or individual people's loans. I think it's a little bit like the Harvey Me situation. I think to some extent, there's a group of people in Washington who are sort of controlling the reins on the system, like Ben Bernanke, like Tim Geithner, like Larry Summers, and she's very knowledgeable and very logical. And I think, though, it's a question of who's kind of strong and who's in the club by more, and she's just slightly outside of the club. I mean, I think she should be head of the Fed. But
Yeah, hi. Can you just...
And Elizabeth Warren should be Treasury Secretary.
Can you tell me again, so it started out at a $700 billion bailout, and then you said it ended up at $14 trillion. So
right.
Can you just summarize that again really quickly? And then my next question is, where did the $14 trillion minus the $700 billion, where does that come from?
Okay. That's a very good question, and that is a predominant amount of the book. And I will just... Also, there are charts on this on my site. But basically, there was about $8 trillion worth of 8 different loan facilities, and basically like credit unions for banks, that were created by the Federal Reserve during the crisis period. And some were longer-term loans, some were short-term loans, but basically this notion of extending the possibility of different kinds of loans to the industry. And when they created these facilities, they also allow the collateral for those loans to the industry to be posted in a manner where the collateral was less good than it was in the past. It used to be that, say, banks would have to just post treasury bonds, AAA U.S. government-backed treasury bonds in return for money from the Fed. They dropped that notion and started allowing, we don't know, because they won't tell us, but probably some of those toxic assets or things like them or rated like them in return for a lot of the loans. That $8 trillion is now about $6 trillion. A couple of the facilities have been closed, but that, for example, was a big chunk of what went on. And in addition, there were guarantees made that weren't part of TARP, for example, to back Bear Stearns. For example, a component of the AIG aspect came not out of TARP, but out of the Treasury Department, the Fed mix. There was $301 billion that was a mix between the Treasury Department and the Fed, and to some extent backed by the FDIC, who got sort of brought into the equation to guarantee some of their assets. So the way it breaks down is some stuff was loan, some stuff was cash, or just strict capital, like TARP, and some stuff was sort of guarantees on assets that the banks still hold on their own books, but could go either way, could have more value or less value. And again, from my standpoint, I don't think the right questions are being asked to determine what value those assets really do have. So I think they're just like picking numbers, but that's a part of it. So it sort of breaks down to around $8 trillion from the Fed. There was a few trillion from the Treasury Department. The FDIC had to back about $1.5 or so trillion of debt, because at the time last year, and this is another way that FDIC got brought in, they decided that there wasn't enough credit flowing in the system meaning bank to bank. And so the FDIC said, well, we'll come in and guarantee any money you raise up to that amount. So, for example, Goldman Sachs raised $29 billion worth of money in one of these FDIC programs. Goldman Sachs, who does not have deposits from real people, there's no right to have anything from the FDIC, for example, raised $29 billion backed by the FDIC, which made them able to raise it a lot more cheaply than if it's just, oh, it's us. Because at the time, nobody trusted banks. Banks didn't trust banks. And that was one of the other ways that money was given in. So when I look at the 13 trillion, I include all of that. I do also include, for example, the $787 billion stimulus package. There are aspects of that, about 9% that you could argue went either to government-sponsored entities or basically mortgage-type government-related mortgage companies and individuals, whether it's tax credits or other types of help. So there was some that went in that bailout, but I think a lot of it was because of the Wall Street aspect. And most of it went to Wall Street.
Yeah, I've listened to you today, and you talk about the repeal of replacing Glass-Steagall and reseparating the two banks, types of bank. And I've read Simon Johnson, I've listened to Mervyn King and his Churchillian speeches about so much being owed by so few to so many. And you all say the same thing, and yet just a minute ago, answering the other gentleman's question, you talk about a group that's just outside the circle and a group that's just inside. And Simon Johnson's word for talking about it is ideological capture, which he separates from corruption, which he talked about in the 1997 Asian financial crisis. What I'm building up to is, what does it take to push it over and get the right people in before we all go bankrupt? And if you say you're going to get the right people in and get these things passed, what does the $13 trillion turn into? Does it turn into $5 trillion, $3 trillion?
No, that's a really good question. I don't know how to get Tim Geithner out of office. I think, for example, I'm just picking a name. I do think that whether it's stuff that Simon Johnson is writing or even the fact that Paul Volcker, who's sort of on the outside of his own circle, unfortunately, who has also spoken about, as a former Fed chairman and as a very rational person who was also against the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, who has said, this is not tenable. We should reduce the amount of trading, the amount of speculation that banks can do and sort of de facto divide them, isn't being listened to. Every single time he says something, he kind of gets shunted outside of his own party. I don't know how to do that. I mean, all I know is that in the demonstrations that happen, in the communications that happen, certain TV people, that there's a way to support, at least. I mean, I don't know how else to do this beyond sort of, attacking Tim Geithner physically, which is no, but to extract him. But I mean, the idea of just continuing to be really dissatisfied. I mean, for example, the move that Sanders did and that that Bunnings did, who's a Republican from Kentucky, as an independent, got together and said we're going to put a hold on Ben Bernanke's confirmation when it looked so, and I think it'll probably happen anyway, but it looked so like it was going to happen. Despite everybody's feelings on this outside of the circle. And then it's like, well, there's a hold, so it can't be a simple, meaning there can't be a simple majority vote in the Senate Banking Committee. It has to be a wider vote. More people in the Senate have to actually put their hearts on the line and their votes on the line and say, we want this guy. So it becomes that much more difficult. I think that was a result, to some extent, of their own beliefs, but I think to a larger extent of what they're hearing from the outside and what they're hearing from people. Because I think even in the Glass-Steagall times, we look back at history and, I maybe even glamorize it myself too much, I don't know. But I think, because there was such a push from the side of the citizenry, it made it easier to vote a certain way. And I think when Glass-Steagall was repealed, no one was involved in this. I mean, Summers was there, all those guys were involved, but I mean, individuals, people, this wasn't something we weren't talking about it in the country when it happened. It almost sort of happened without us, and then it was sort of sold basically like it was such a great idea. We're free markets, and the U.S. is going to be competitive, and blah, blah, blah. I think now we're more aware. And so I think just like back in the 30s when we were aware for different reasons, I think we actually just have to keep pushing these guys out.
With what you said about how the government should have worked with the subprime mortgage holders instead of AIG and the other companies, what's your opinion of the statements that were made last year when the bailouts were initially proposed about how if AIG and the other companies were not propped up, then everyday normal people would suffer?
Well, first of all, what we've seen since then is that everyday normal people have suffered. So just, and we wouldn't have known that at the time, but just if we look back at the level of unemployment, the level of credit problems in the country, the level of foreclosures, by any stretch of however you measure it, It's all worse now than it was then. So the question is, would it have been doubly worse or not? And I don't believe that had AIG been, not gone under, but been dissected and had the bad piece go under, that it would have had a bad effect on, and it would have had a bad effect at the time. It certainly would have slammed AIG's stock price. But had the government come in and just supported by a minor amount whatever it had to do within AIG that was related to individual, like insurance policy holders, which really wasn't the problem, but let's say they said it was part of the whole systemic problem, so one was going to impact the other. And so let's say they even did that for whatever it would have cost, which would have been almost nothing. And then taken the credit derivatives component, the financial products component, that's in an insurance company trading like mad and leveraging these positions like mad, and said, you know what? You acted like a hedge fund, you blew up, you're done. It would not have brought down the economy. What would have happened is everyone who had an agreement, a credit agreement with AIG would have had to negotiate for their piece. They would have brought up lawyers, and they would have dealt in bankruptcy court, and they would have done all the things that they do every time any company goes bad. And some of them would have gotten it, and some of them wouldn't have. And at the end of it, Goldman would have probably gotten $13 billion. I'm sure they would have tried to extract a bunch. They might have gotten a couple out of it. They might have lined themselves up first in terms of some of the rest of the customers of AIG when they're all sort of fighting for whatever AIG had left. But the main part of the company that was a part of the actual population or dealing with the actual population could have been siphoned off, protected, and the rest could have just sort of sunk and gone off. It would have been a lot cheaper. And the same thing could have been done with any of the companies.
As a matter of local interest, I was going to ask you a question about your feelings, your input as to the Washington Mutual debacle and takeover, which that's too easy. But the real question is, with Summers, Geithner, and Bernanke staying in their positions as is likely, and do you see any hope for us?
Well, again, I have to hope. I wouldn't be talking to you if I didn't have hope, and I don't think you would be here. I know some of you, and all of you should rightfully be angry. I don't know what each of your individual thoughts are on this, but I think we have to hope that there's. We can't necessarily, or maybe we can, but overthrow the banking system as it is tomorrow, but that we can continue to sort of push back. I think the confirmation of Bernanke will go through, but I also think that there's a lot of stuff against him, and it's not over, and the vote hasn't happened. And I think if we can get him out, which I think is really hard, but I mean, it's like there are senators on the fence, then Tim Geithner gets really freaked out. Because then all of a sudden there were three guys that architected this whole bailout and lied about what it would do for the rest of the general economy, both in terms of how much it would damage it would do if it didn't happen and how much credit it would release if it did happen. And then you have like Geithner out there who will be like, wait a minute, like Hank Paulson's not Treasury Secretary anymore, so one of the three is gone. If Ben Bernanke could get gone, which again that's a long shot, but he's not voted in yet, then he gets scared. And I think even if Bernanke gets voted in by not a really strong, solid number, which will happen, I think he has to get scared, and then we have to kind of keep pushing. In terms of Wells Fargo, in terms of Washington Mutual and J.P. Morgan Chase, that was a coup. I mean, that was like Bear Stearns and J.P. Morgan, but to a different extent. This was a company, Washington Mutual in particular, that J.P. Morgan had wanted to buy for years. And it was always too expensive. And so all of a sudden, in a very quick move, Washington Mutual has like two choices: go bankrupt and sort of be driven up into pieces and FDICized and everything else, and possibly regroup as a stronger bank when it was having problems. But that wasn't a choice that was given. The only choice that was given was to be very cheaply assumed by J.P. Morgan in a Fed and Treasury Department brokered deal. Washington Mutual is like one of the only companies that didn't actually have a relationship separately with Goldman, which was just interesting. Jamie Dimon, who's the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, has a solid relationship with them and certainly a strong position on the New York Fed. But Washington Mutual is kind of the one out there that didn't really bother them or have anything to do with them, which is a whole separate other circle. But I do think it was something J.P. Morgan wanted. All of these big banks, this is again, it goes back to the Glass-Steagall notion, want to become bigger. They can't compete in their new sphere without being big. So Washington Mutual is like, what do you take over? It could have been Wachovia, but it wasn't done yet. You know, it wasn't about to sort of implode yet. You had Washington Mutual. There was really not a lot of other things it could assume. It had just gotten Bear Stearns. So it became a stronger animal, and it was a stronger animal. It was all basically brokered in Washington, not even in the boardrooms of banks.
Maybe you already answered my question. Back to Glass-Steagall. Is the Glass-Steagall Act and the Bernie Sanders bill and everything else that they're proposing, is that enough by itself to stand alone and hold things back? Because the reason this legal Ponzi scheme worked, because it was legal, and everybody knew that they weren't going to jail. Mm-hmm. So, and the SEC actually helped facilitate it as well. Mm-hmm. So it seems that there are no cops in the system. Mm-hmm. So you can't just throw bills and laws out and expect it to happen. Where are the cops, and how big a wall do we have to put up?
No, that's that is a really good question. The wording that Bernanke had used in an op-ed he put out in the Washington Post before his hearing the other day said something about how he had arrested the problem, and I remember reading it saying, well, you arrested nobody. That's the problem. But what the disconnection or the sort of Glass-Steagall impact on banks just enables us to really start dealing with the problem, which is basically saying, look, you know, the regulators really failed in so many ways, and sometimes because it was legal. For example, the SEC voted in 2004 to increase leverage, to basically increase what you could borrow against these boxes to $30 to $1 from $12 to $1. So they basically multiplied by over 2.5 times the amount of risk that investment banks, for example, like Goldman and Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers could take. That in itself was wrong. That requires like a 5-minute conversation at the SEC, for example, to say, you know what, let's just like take that back. So it's like there's a list of things that need to be done, I think, to really fix it. Dividing the banks allows the banks not to continue to use individual deposits and loans as kind of material for the risk, knowing it will get backed. So that's what dissecting it does. And it also, part of Glass-Steagall didn't just dissect banks. It wasn't like you're an either or. It basically said something else. It said that you have to reduce the amount of risk you take or the amount of speculation that you take to be not more than 10% of all of your revenue. So they actually put a risk floor on it, which no one's really talking about right now in Washington, not just dividing the banks. So basically reduce the risk of the system so we're not backing it. You can reduce it by changing some of those SEC laws. And, yeah, you have to somehow make the notion of regulators doing their job better, to some extent making the banks easier to watch because they're smaller and possibly less complex, will hopefully help them do their job. I mean, it's a hard problem. Again, you're dealing with the books of these banks. They're so convoluted. You've got teams of accountants and teams of, compliance. There's so many people involved in creating a bank balance sheet, and you have probably 5 people at the SEC trying to deal with it. So it is a problem. So I think if you make it at least a more simplified problem, we have a better shot.
I don't have much confidence that Congress is going to do anything anytime soon that will really benefit the common folk. And in the meantime, I'm wondering how I can protect myself. And one of the things I've done is move what little I have left into a local bank and local credit union. Mm-hmm. And what maddens me is that folks, small businesses can't get credit. People are losing their homes. Nothing is being done for them that's significant. I'm wondering what you think about the creation of a state bank, the purpose of which would be to extend credit to small business, maybe to homeowners. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about that as a tactic in the interim to protect ourselves?
That's a really, really good question. I think a couple of things. One, as we unfortunately have seen while these big banks have been being plumped up, a lot of small banks have been going under. The FDIC has closed like 126 banks this year, only 27 last year, 3 the year before. So there's this increase in banks that are having to close because they don't have the same kind of support. So the whole system has become even less equal for the system, for the financial system than it was before as well. And I think that the credit unions, for the most part, have not had those same failures. They didn't make the same kind of risks in their balance sheet that the bigger banks did. They didn't leverage 30 times like investment banks, or really very much at all. They basically had more of an understanding of where they were loaning to, more of a kind of analysis of who they were loaning to, and also more of an impetus to renegotiate loans, which has been a big part of this. I mean, if you can dump $13 trillion into the banking system, imagine if you can actually create a situation where you're not asking the banks to do it, please, which is what Washington has been doing, but you're demanding that the banks do. You can renegotiate loans, but from a credit union's perspective, that's what they have. So they are better at renegotiation, which is what you need. It is a lot of they're better at a lot of things. I did a piece on this as well from a standpoint of savings rates. Some of the smaller banks and credit unions have higher rates for savings accounts and checking accounts. They have lower charges and interest rates for the credit cards that they extend. They're better at renegotiating loans, and they're better at giving out credit. So I do think that dealing with some of the smaller banks is a way to do that. Where the big banks get you is, okay, well, you won't have an ATM everywhere, and you'll have to pay like $3 to get your money out. And that's true, but a lot of times, even if you're with a big bank, they don't have a relationship with each other, and you wind up having to pay those fees anyway. But that idea of sort of being all-encompassing, you can see them on every corner, so they use that, where credit unions don't have that. But they certainly are better, in most cases, with their customers.
You just partially answered the conversation that I wanted to have, which is how we as individuals can empower ourselves, and that being the case. I recently also changed to a credit union, and that's been my fantasy with my anger is what if all over the country we as consumers, that is something we can do other than writing our congresspeople, our senators, watching C-SPAN, same thing over and over again, may or may not change.
Walk with your wallet.
But again, and Washington State is very good about that. People really empowering with their dollars to support what they want to stop feeding the beasts.
No,
so you partially answered that is what would the ramifications be if people really, really move their money and their consumer deposits to well-run local banks or credit unions? And what if this happened all over the country?
Yeah, and what if we emphasize that it is happening? Because I think people tend to do things. You did it. You're doing it. It's sort of like if one person does, if a group does, if a community does, more people feel they can. So I think there is an aspect of making that a move and actually, sort of
on a grassroots level,
well.
I'd love to see it happening on a national level. Yeah.
I think that's a great idea. And I think a lot of people in some of the cities I've been at have done that, have actually moved into some credit unions or small banks and made that very point. Like, how do we walk with our money? And I think that's definitely something. And I think because it will take time, making a point of it, as well as doing it, is a way to walk away from the bigger beasts and actually make them smaller, as well as doing all the more reformistic things. I think, are we done?
I just wanted to sneak in. When I listen to a lot of these congressmen and senators, they're so self-satisfied, and I'm thinking about Jay Inslee, but I'm not really trying to pick on him. But, they're like, oh, you don't know how close to the brink we got, and we saved the economy and all that. And
we didn't.
Yeah.
No, I mean.
And it's like, what would have happened if we just let these parasites just fail?
Well, that was my point with AIG. I mean, some of the banks, like Washington Mutual, were basically failed, but the result of their failure was to feed into J.P. Morgan Chase with government backing. And that's sort of the wrong kind of failure. I mean, if we had let the parts of these institutions, or full institutions, it's the cases if they were like a Lehman Brothers, I had no problem with that failing. It took risk, it took it wrong, it shouldn't have gotten bailed out, stuff happens. But, something like a Bear Stearns, and I worked at Bear, I knew a lot of the people who were involved in it, and it was very unfortunate how it went into J.P. Morgan. But I think if you had let them fail, but dissected them also, so again, you're not letting all of AIG fail, you're not necessarily letting all of any bank fail, if it's also doing stuff with the population, with general consumers, with small businesses across the country. You take that part out. It really isn't hard. It's not as hard as the banks wanted us to believe it is, as Bernanke and Paulson and everybody wanted to believe it is, as it was sold into Congress. Without them even thinking about, oh my God, is there another way? I mean, a lot of what happened last year, too, this was an election year, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's like, why is the banking system doing this to us? I mean, we don't want to be responsible for real catastrophe. And I continue, they really don't understand banking. And I mean, the senators who don't want to understand it, as well as the ones who I think may want to do something about it, I think there's a lot to try and understand this. If you don't understand something, you tend to be more scared of it. But I don't think the economy would have collapsed. Yeah, the market might have been down a little bit more. There would have been some problems with the aspects of those firms that might have been sold out or dissected. There would have been a bunch of bankruptcy court battles. But banks have gone under before. Investment banks have gone under before. Paine Webber was an investment bank that basically got downed. Drexel Burnham, which was part of the whole junk bond era, blew up, got taken down. I mean, it happens. And yes, a lot of this stuff was happening at the same time, but had you divided the risk components, if they didn't have enough capital to survive, they either had to find it or they weren't going to survive. It actually would have had the benefit of stabilizing the system going forward, not costing $13 trillion or whatever, and also making the point that you just can't do that. And it would not have brought down the economy. I mean, it just wouldn't have.
I don't know if I can ask one more, but I read people like Krugman, and he's very supportive of Bernanke. And Krugman seems to be somebody that's interested in the general well-being of people. So I'm just trying to figure out, how do I reconcile
I don't
these
understand why Krugman's supportive of Bernanke. I mean, I like Krugman, and I do, I follow him, and I respect him, and I admire him. But I think that he does believe, or he does from what he writes, that had Bernanke not pushed all of this money into the system, it would have collapsed and we would have had chaos. And I think perhaps that goes into not having thought of the alternative at the time, which would have been to dissect and banner out some of the risky elements and just support the rest of them, which I think would have been cheaper, which Bernanke, of course, didn't do. So, and maybe to some extent, it's also an issue of the Fed. Whether it's Bernanke or whoever's the head there, would they have done the same thing? And maybe with that trio that was in place, whoever was in place would have done the same thing. But I just don't agree with him.